Beneath the vast waters of our oceans lie millions of shipwrecks, thousands of them left behind from the devastation of World War II. Underneath their rusting hulls are potentially billions of gallons of oil, and as they gradually corrode, many are threatening to leak their toxic cargo.
Rust doesn't sleep. It's something that's going to be happening soon.
These wrecks pose a threat not only to marine life, but also to the communities who are dependent on the sea to make a living. So what exactly is at stake, and who should clean up these long-forgotten World War II relics? Allied ships in blue and Axis ships in red. This map shows shipwrecks left behind from World War II. They make up most of the 8,500 wrecks in the world at risk of leaking oil and contaminants. Naval battles cause havoc throughout the Atlantic, Pacific and Indian Oceans and beyond. The Indian Ocean raid in 1942 saw Allied and Japanese forces clash in the Bay of Bengal, with dozens of ships sunk. Long forgotten, many such wrecks and their cargo remain undocumented.
It's out of sight, out of mind. It's not something which is really in people's faces.
Matt Carter works as a researcher for an Australian-based NGO, which has been working to identify wrecks specifically in the Pacific region.
We know there are thousands of them across the Pacific. The exact location is not necessarily known. How bad, how much impact they could potentially have is unknown.
After 80 years underwater, these shipwrecks are corroding, their hulls getting ready to collapse.
And we know that structures will corrode based on different factors, like pressure, temperature, salinity, currents.
That's Zhao Zusa, a marine engineer working for the International Union for Conservation of Nature.
It will corrode, it will not last forever, nothing lasts forever.
And severe storms and earthquakes could make matters worse. Two extreme phenomena that studies suggest are becoming more frequent. That's a worry in regions such as the Bay of Bengal, which is prone to cyclones.
If you have a storm surge and these gigantic waves in an atoll, where a boat has been resting for 40, 50 years untouched, all it takes is a small nudge. We're talking nothing to reach. Even a small earthquake can move a ship, depending on the condition that it is and the balance.
Well, we're marching towards this deadline almost of where they will collapse. It's just the nature of these structures being underwater. They will collapse in the near future, and any oil that they hold will come out.
The consequences would be far-reaching, according to experts, hurting marine life as well as people along the coastline.
So when we understand the potential impacts of these sunken vessels, is everything that potentially will be lost. Jobs, fisheries.
Even relatively small amounts of oil coming out can have catastrophic impacts. So it doesn't necessarily have to wipe out an entire island, but if the oil goes into the mangroves are where the fish spawn, then you've wiped out that component of their life.
So how can disaster be averted? The first challenge is figuring out which shipwrecks are where and what fuel they have on board. The Major Projects Foundation has gone to great lengths mapping out parts of the Pacific.
And that included going into the Japanese archives. From that we can get a bit of an idea of how much fuel and what cargo the ships may have had on the day that they were sunk.
Next up, the NGO has made use of satellite imagery.
There's these kilometre-long slicks of oil coming off them. So with the satellite imagery, we were able to look at all these wrecks across the region and actually focus in on which helped us, I guess, find which ones were the highest risk.
Then it's a case of actually diving down to the wrecks, some of which are in very remote locations, to better understand their condition and cargo. Matt Carter and his colleagues have focused on two main sites in the Pacific Ocean. The first is Chook Lagoon in Micronesia, which now hosts a graveyard of ships following a naval battle between the US and Japan in 1944. Operation Hailstone, as it was named, saw more than 40 Japanese ships sunk. Among them, an oil tanker which Matt says could have held 800,000 gallons of oil.
Chook has 20 wrecks which we consider to be kind of high environmental risk that we've been assessing. I think of that 20, it's going to be about 15 of them are going to need intervention.
The collateral damage didn't stop when the war finished either.
This is Bikini.
Bikini Atoll, a remote site on the outskirts of Micronesia, became the site of nuclear testing in 1946.
They detonated two nuclear devices to see what would happen.
They being the United States. Less than a year after decimating Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic bombs to end World War II, the US loaded up a fleet of ships with fuel, chemicals, explosive ordnance, you name it, all in the name of simulating a realistic scenario for a nuclear explosion.
And at the time, it would have been the 6th largest fleet in the world. So enormous. Battleships, aircraft carriers, submarines, destroyers, cruisers, everything.
That included captured Japanese battleship, the Nagato, spanning 220 metres and loaded with more than 47,000 tonnes at the time.
It's a huge ship. It's a genuine battleship. And it was fueled with heavy fuel oil, which is pretty nasty stuff.
You have all sorts of contaminants, basically heavy fuel oil, unexploded ordnance, TNT, lead, mercury.
Gathering all this knowledge is essential for the final step, the cleanup.
You know where it is, you know how much it is, you know exactly what components are inside, how they will react, you know the depth, you know the currents, you know everything, so you can start it's a question of preparedness.
And this is where the real challenge starts. Simply speaking, it's a matter of sucking the oil out of the old tanks. But this is more complicated than it sounds. Some hulls could collapse if tampered with, other wrecks are so deep it requires autonomous vehicles to do the handiwork.
You have to drill holes, you have to make sure that any holes that you're drilling into the fuel tanks are going to be safe, stable. You're not going to just drill a hole and the entire side of the ship's going to collapse and release all the oil.
The depth, water pressure and temperature, currents and remoteness all dictate how complicated extraction will be. Thankfully, these highly skilled extraction methods are already tried and tested. The real bottlenecks are funding the salvage operations and even gaining permission to access the wrecks. Extracting oil can cost anywhere between $6 and $10 million per ship.
One, it's just so expensive, and also getting the political support to do that, because a lot of these wrecks are politically sensitive. A lot of the wrecks are war graves, a lot of them are tourism assets for countries as well. So we're balancing these values against each other, archaeological sites, historical sites, so it is complicated.
In 2018, the Prince Eugen, a warship involved in those US nuclear tests we mentioned earlier, was actually drained of its oil in a partnership between the US and Marshall Islands governments. They removed about 230,000 gallons of fuel oil. So it can be done, but there might be another 8,000 potentially polluting wrecks still out there. And although many have been located, it's still not known exactly how many sunken ships there are and what threat they pose. That's where Project Tangaroa comes in. Funded by the Lloyd's Register Foundation, a UK-based charity, it's working to build a global framework that can help identify which wrecks need to be taken care of first and find the funding for cleanup missions.
We need to understand who's going to support efforts for mitigation and restoration, especially for countries that have no capacity to defend themselves.
The question of who's responsible for these wrecks is complex to say the least. For instance, the ships at Chuuk Lagoon are Japanese vessels sunk by the United States, but located near countries that were not active participants in World War II.
I think there's a way to talk about environmental justice without pointing fingers and just say, listen, aiming for solutions.
Instead, Project Tangaroa wants to increase collaboration between governments, pooling data, expertise, and funding. Extracting the oil is a costly exercise, but it pales compared to the worst-case scenario of a massive oil spill. In 1989, the Exxon Valdez leaked 11 million gallons of oil into the Gulf of Alaska. It reportedly cost billions of dollars in overall damages, but even smaller spills from these shipwrecks would still be devastating.
It doesn't have to be an Exxon Valdez massive spill with pelicans covered in oil to actually do really major damage in such a fragile and interconnected environment.
For these archipelago nations, such spills would have long-lasting consequences, and they're asking richer nations for more assistance.
The Micronesian government has been asking for international support for probably, best part of 20 years, really. They are the developing countries. They don't have a huge amount of money, and any country in the world would struggle with some of these challenges.
The legacy of World War II and the big powers responsible is not just in the history books. It's still there in the very waters that surround us. The threat of these shipwrecks leaking oil into our oceans is very real, and that threat is only growing as time ticks by and their structures corrode more and more. The bad news, securing funding and getting countries working together is a big challenge. But the good news, once that's sorted, it's fairly straightforward.
This is a very solvable problem. Identify a high-profile shipwreck, get the resourcing to remove the oil, take the oil away, job done. So it is, there is hope. There is hope there.
What do you reckon? Who should clean up these wrecks? Let us know in the comments, hit subscribe, and check out more information on DW.com.